Welcome to the second episode of my Worst Game series, and I've got some absolute gems lined up this time. The games I've chosen are some of the worst I've ever had the misfortune to play. From games with terrible design and broken gameplay, to massive disappointments that I was really looking forward to. Now if you haven't seen the first episode, make sure to check it out once you've finished watching this one. So let's begin with an ambitious handheld port of one of my favourite games of all time. The year is 1995. Now just imagine being able to take one of the greatest games ever made on your travels with you. Now, get ready for one of the biggest disappointments the Game Boy ever saw, as this port makes you wish you'd forgotten to replace those batteries or just left the console at home. This port is based more on the Championship Edition or Hyper Fighting games, with 3 of the boss characters available to choose from and notable special attacks such as Chun-Li's Fireball and Ryu and Ken's Air Hurricane kicks. The game looked great in screenshots, but unfortunately, when the game is in action, it's a different story. The gameplay is absolutely abysmal, with choppy movements that completely destroy the essence of what made Street Fighter 2 so incredible. Move inputs seem to take forever, and you just find yourself mindlessly jumping and attacking for the most part. On the plus side, the music is generally very good, with some quality versions of each theme. Much the same can be said about the sound effects, which fit the on-screen action nicely. Porting Street Fighter 2 to the Game Boy was a very ambitious project, but they could have taken a different route, which would have suited the limitations of the handheld for a more enjoyable experience. Takara did an incredible job with the SNK fighting games on the system, so there really is no excuse. I remember hearing about what was essentially a 3D scrolling beat-em-up coming to the Dreamcast. Hand-to-hand combat mixed with hack-and-slash elements in a fantasy world. This sounded similar to Golden Axe, but believe me, this is not Golden Axe. Soul Fighter was released in 1999 and was developed by Toka. You know Toka, they made Adidas Power Soccer and Burning Road for the PlayStation. The introduction is laughable, with a really poorly animated 3D king spouting some rubbish about a birthday hunt. Right from the off, you are presented with one of the single most annoying parts of the game. Each time you encounter an enemy, the music changes, and it's the same tune over and over each time. The music is such a terrible part of this game, and part of the reason I despise it so much. Hang on, is this a different game? No, it's a prime example of cutscenes being totally disconnected from the gameplay, and what's odd in this case is that the cutscenes look worse. Much worse. The cutscenes in this game are some of the worst I've ever seen. Some of them are absolutely hilarious. The team hovering over the gate is one of the best, with the character Orion using his powers to lift everyone up and over in the game's signature awkward manner. The gameplay is horrendous, with unresponsive moves, an awful control setup, and a camera that positions itself just about anywhere it likes. I won't go on too much more. If you really do want to experience not only one of the worst games on the Dreamcast, but one of the worst games ever, then grab a copy of Toka's Soul Fighter. Operation Wolf was a big part of my life when I was growing up. I was absolutely mesmerised when it was first released, and I used to watch my dad play it every time we would visit an arcade. This of course was followed up by Operation Thunderbolt, which enhanced the experience by adding another gun to the cabinet for 2-player action. Fast forward to 1994, when East Technology attempted to resurrect the series with Operation Wolf 3. Now let's get something out of the way before we begin. I absolutely detest digitized graphics. This trend was at its peak around this time, and they were everywhere. It was like living in a digitized nightmare. This totally destroys the game, not only in the way it looks, but the damage it did to a series which I held in such high regard. Gone were the original machine guns of Thunderbolt. Instead, we were presented with futuristic looking blasters to shoot generic enemies in dull and lifeless locations. There is nothing really wrong with the gameplay itself, but slapping the Operation Wolf name on something so bland was an insult to the series. One of the main features of the Operation Wolf games was the constantly scrolling levels, meaning the action was never tied to a single screen. A lot of the time, this entry in the series is stuck on a single screen and it gets really dull really quickly. Overall, it was a huge disappointment. I remember seeing it for the first time when I walked into the arcade at the old Trocadero in London. Unfortunately, the demo screens told me everything I needed to know. Avoid. When I owned an Amiga, I was really into football games and owned lots of them. Of course, there were some incredible examples on the system, but then there were some which were terrible. I remember seeing European Football Champ and thinking it sounded familiar. Looking closer, I saw the Taito name and I realised it was a port of the Football Champ arcade game, which at the time was one of my go-to games whenever I saw a cabinet. This port was handled by Domark, and despite their best efforts to replicate the original, it falls short on just about everything. The zooming in and out was a big part of the game's character in the arcade. They tried to recreate it here, but it is absolutely terrible and should have just been left out. The controls work reasonably well with the limitations of a single button, but the gameplay itself is really poor. It rarely feels like you connect properly with the ball. All of those one-touch passes to get the ball upfield just don't work how they did in the arcade, and you find yourself mindlessly lobbing the ball forward and then having to regain possession again. This game was just a really big disappointment. I thought the Amiga would have been able to handle a port of Football Champ well, but I was sadly wrong. One thing it does have going for it is the ability to knock the cameraman over with the ball. But unfortunately, that's not quite enough to make a spectacular save. In 2003, I imported a Japanese PS2 console and a copy of the Sega Ages version of Golden Axe at the time it was released. I really only bought the console because of this game, thinking it would bring me great joy and transport me back to 1989. I thought this looked pretty good in the screenshots, but I'd never actually seen it in action before I bought it. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. After what seemed like a decent intro, it cuts to some footage of Death Adder, animated in such a way that I started worrying about what I'd let myself in for. After the title screen, this concern only built further, as you are presented with an awful character selection screen, which is such a shame considering how iconic the original was. When you start to play, it doesn't take long to realise just how different it plays to the original game. The combat is really flawed, with terrible hit detection and a lack of any real impact when you strike an enemy. The game just seems to drag on forever, with the same enemies over and over again. The stages also seem unnecessarily long. The original game had very short stages, but each section felt like an iconic set piece. Here, everything lacks character and each situation just feels empty. Perhaps the only positive here is the music. It's not a patch on the original, but the modern versions are decent representations. So, not only was this one a massive disappointment, it was also absolutely terrible in almost every way. The Golden Axe series has had some rough treatment since its prime, and this is definitely one of the worst attempts to resurrect it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below and subscribe to the channel for more retro gaming content.